Before we dive right in and start configuring conditional access policies, we have to understand what conditional access policies are. We have to understand some of the signals and understand an overview of the different settings that we can configure and some of the other related technologies that we have to configure along with conditional access policies. Microsoft does a pretty good job at defining conditional access in the article we see right here. A couple things I want to point out. Conditional access is Microsoft's zero trust policy engine taking signals from various sources into account when enforcing policy decisions. Conditional access policies, at their simplest, are if-then statements. If a user wants to access a resource, then they must complete an action. For example, if a user wants to access an application or service like Microsoft 365, then they must perform multi-factor authentication to gain access. Also important, conditional access policies are enforced after first factor authentication is completed. So what happens typically is the user authenticates with their username or password, and then there are conditions that have to be met in order for that user, after they authenticate, to still be able to access the resources in Azure or Microsoft 365. Azure, same thing as Entra ID. So if we scroll down a little bit, we're going to see a list of some common signals. These signals include, in the list right here, okay, what are we looking for? A certain user or group membership to determine their access, an IP location, a device, an application, a risk detection, Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Those are some typical signals. And if we scroll down just a little bit further, it lists some common decisions. Based off of these signals, what are we going to do with those signals? Are we going to block access or grant access? Are we going to require MFA, a certain authentication strength, require the device to be marked as compliant, require to be a hybrid join to Entra, require a certain client app, you can only use certain apps, an app protection policy, require password change, terms of use, all those kind of common decisions. So now that we have a basic understanding of conditional access policies and the fundamentals on signals and decisions, in this video, we'll take a little deeper dive into configuring the specific settings for the conditional access policy that we need to configure. One more thing about conditional access policies is it does require licensing that includes at least a P1. So that could be a P1 separate licensing or a P2 license, or something like E3 with EMS or Microsoft 365, an M365 license, or an E5, or whatever includes a license that has the P1 included or separately purchased. For complete details, take a look at the URL shown here. In every conditional access policy, we have two main categories that we can choose a number of settings from: assignments and access controls. We have to choose at least a minimal number of settings from each one of those categories. We have to choose at least users and target resources and conditions from assignments, and at least grant from access controls. You may be able to choose just users or just conditions depending on the scenario, but certainly target resources and either users or conditions. Users allows you to choose the users, groups, etc. that the policy applies to. When we click on the hyperlink, it allows us to choose the assignments for this. In most of the settings, we're going to have an include and exclude. So an exclude would just be able to give you the option to say, okay, include is typically more general than the exclude. So for instance, we may want to typically say, we're going to include all users in this policy, but we're going to exclude certain users. When testing and piloting before you roll out to production, you're not going to include all users. You're going to create a specific, probably a user group, not a device group, in Entra ID. And you're going to target that while you're testing and piloting, and just continue to add more and more users to that group. So in this scenario, if we're testing at this stage, before we roll it out to all users, we'd click on select users and groups, and then just click on, select and choose the users that we want to add as part of our pilot or test group. Target resources includes assignment for apps, internet resources, actions, or authentication context to target for the policy. So let's go ahead and click on that. See what our options are. We select what type of resource, but typically it's the cloud apps, or whether it's user actions or authentication context, but typically it's resources, type of app that you want to protect. And in this scenario, I'm choosing Office 365, or you could say all resources. And then, again, we've got an include and exclude. But if you were going to click on select and click on the hyperlink, you would come up with a list. In this case, it's a list of apps because I've chosen resources of which apps to protect. And you could search that list. Underneath network, you can define source locations. For example, you could define any location, trusted locations, or selected network locations that the user is signing in from as a condition for the policy. Taking a look at those settings, if we wanted to configure this, we have to click on yes. And the default is any network location. So when we get to access controls and we select either grant or block, we could say we're going to grant access. We could have a conditional access policies that says we're going to grant access from all trusted network and locations, but nothing outside of that would be allowed. That requires that we configure that trusted network location list separately. Or we can click on selected networks and locations and define them here which would go into a separate list that would be maintained in Entra. And then grant access. The alternative way to do it is to create a different conditional access policy that blocks any network or location, and then as in the include, and then exclude just your trusted network and locations. In that sense, what you're saying is essentially nobody can sign into these apps, blah, 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 in the target resources unless they're inside my corporate network that I've defined. I can't stress enough, and I think it's worth mentioning at this point, how there's a lot of planning that has to go into this, and especially testing with test accounts before you move on to even piloting. Conditions define under which circumstances a policy will apply. For example, user or sign-in risk, device platforms, basically the operating systems like Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, Linux, those kind of things. Client apps, like only Microsoft approved client apps, etc. So if we take a look at that, the first three conditions are relatively new, and they are great security measures. Now, obviously it's not perfect. You could say, well, I'm going to define user risk, sign-in risk, and insider risk. And Microsoft might think that, or detect that a user is a risk. And maybe that user is a consultant that's, connected in one browser and then a VPN to a customer and another browser, another app, and it detects it. So, careful consideration there, if you choose those. And that's where you might want to have a different conditional access policy for those type of users and have an Entra group for those type of users. But I do often use device platforms. So sometimes I'm going to say that, for instance, in order to access these apps, they have to be using Windows only, maybe, or Android, iOS, and Windows. Maybe not Linux. And of course, there's the include and exclude. And probably more often, I'm going to go into client apps and I'm going to say, for my allow policy, I am not going to allow Exchange Active Sync and other clients for the legacy authentication. And then in another conditional access policy, I'm actually going to block those for security purposes as legacy protocols that are not allowed in my enterprise environment. Now we're past the assignments category and into the access controls category. So if we go to grant and see what type of controls we have there, we have an either or option. Either you're blocking or granting access. So typically you're going to choose one of those, but you might have separate policies with similar settings with the same type of apps and as target resources, and one will allow it under certain conditions and one will block it under different conditions. So let's say I have a conditional access policy for multi-factor authentication, MFA. Underneath grant access, I'm going to select require multi-factor authentication. And if you only do that, then you've kind of accomplished what you need to. And that will require Azure multi-factor authentication, not third-party ones. Third-party ones have different setups. You could choose the authentication strength, not required for Entra. Here's another one that I do select often, but I only select it if in my deployment I'm deploying Intune and I want to make sure that Intune is checking for device compliance. So if my environment, my enterprise environment, includes an Intune deployment, then I want to make sure that it passes multi-factor authentication and the device is compliant so it doesn't have any risks. You could also select that the device is hybrid joined. Now, if you're in a completely Active Directory environment where it's hybrid joined and you have no remote work persona users, that your machines were never joined to AD and sync to Entra, then that's fine. If all your devices are joined to AD and sync to Entra, then that's another security measure, so that it's another layer of protection from outside users, compromising the security in your environment. They can't even log in if it's not joined. However, if you've got a workforce, even if your devices are joined, all of your devices that the users use are joined to AD, but occasionally they, might log into, a library or a public resource or something like that, then that's going to lock them out. Or if they, log in from a home device, or they have a computer that's joined to Azure Active Directory Entra, then that's not going to be an option for you. Here's a really nice one, and I like to use this. We talked a little bit about this earlier. Require approved client apps. These are the apps that we can control through an MDM solution like Intune, so we can mitigate the risks better than any third-party app. And so if you do this, they have to, in order to be able to gain access to, whatever apps, let's say it's Microsoft 365, they can't use a third-party app. So if we click on that link to see what those apps are, those approved client app lists, it'll bring you to all the apps that Microsoft says, yes, these are the apps that they can use to access whatever you have listed underneath your target resources over here. So I do this when it comes to highly controlled environments that have compliance regulations and things like that, to improve security. And of course, we have some other options that might be relevant for your environment. An app protection policy, if you have deployed that already. Require password change to further implement security measures. And lastly, if I'm going to say that I want multi-factor authentication and I want to also require that the device is marked as compliant, which is typical, and I may also say that I want an approved client app. I don't want to say just require one of those. I want to go ahead and say require all of those. Otherwise, if any one of these passes, then wow, I'm not even requiring multi-factor authentication if they have a approved client app. So be very careful on that one. And the session is actually a pretty recent addition. Didn't used to have this in conditional access policies. These are advanced controls, and I would recommend that if you want to use these, click over the information buttons that you see here and click on the Learn More to get information on it. It's kind of beyond a fundamentals or an overview on conditional access policies. I will point out a few things. By default, If you do select this, it's in monitor only preview, but you have it block downloads and use custom policy underneath it. A couple of neat ones is sign-in frequency. You can make their session so that they have to re-sign into their session to get access to the resources, the target resources. Hours or days, you could say, every 30 days or whatever. Again, there's some limitations on that. Click on the learn more. It'll tell you all the, parameters and limitations on that. Persistent browser session. How often it keeps that information in your browser. One last thing on this is that some of these options will not show up if you don't have an E5 license. Some of these require an E5 license. So if you don't see some of these options, then you don't have the appropriate licensing. And lastly, before you save, you have 3 options: report only, on or off. I will admit that I almost never have it in report only. What I do as standard practice is that I will turn it on, and then what I'll do underneath user assignment is I will never put it to all users. I will select the groups. I will create an Entra ID group, and that Entra ID group will only include test users to begin with. Now, I'll thoroughly test, and then when I'm happy with thoroughly testing and troubleshooting and retesting and all that kind of stuff, then I might move it on to 1 or 2 pilot users. And the test users, when I test, they have all the same attributes, all the same conditions, all the same permissions, all that kind of stuff before I move on to the pilot group. Then I'll move on to the pilot group. The reporter only it just doesn't work for me very well. I like to see it in action. I don't like to see a report. I want to actually test it myself and make sure that it works and troubleshoot it. So I'm guilty by judgment that I don't typically use report only. Now, you could do it and then move on to the test and pilot phase, but never, ever, ever roll out a new conditional access policy without at least testing and piloting first. And then even when you roll out into production with production users, a little bit at a time, phased approach, the staged rollout. Do not roll it out to all users at once. You're always going to find little things you in certain scenarios, people have certain apps that you didn't consider. You're going to have to troubleshoot. And that's it. Good luck with conditional access policies. As always, leave a comment.